Hello, everyone. I am Amber Amin Ra, and I am a senior data project manager at ICPSR. I'm also a lifelong admirer and fan of Miss Katherine Dunham and her work, her choreography. I've been taking and studying her technique and taking classes since I was 2 or 3 years old. I'm also currently a candidate for technique certification, and I reached out to Kate and Harmony, who will be presenting their data today at CAD, which is the Collegium for African Diaspora Dance. It's a conference that meets every other year. And I was lucky to go last year when they were presenting their work. And I immediately thought, we need their data. So I pitched a quick elevator pitch to them, gave them my card, reached out when I got home, and we started talking about the data they were collecting, how amazing it is, and the ways that ICPSR could disseminate their data. Talk about their data, help them talk about their data, and get the data into the hands of dance researchers and regular people who just care about Miss Dunham's legacy and her work. I met Miss Dunham officially when I was about 11 years old. It was 1993. Don't do any math. My mom was getting her certification, and we were living in East St. Louis, Illinois, in one of Miss Dunham's houses. And I would get to sit at her feet and listen to her tell stories of her travels, the people she had met, the people she had taught, people who were in her dance company that are, famous to us now, but they were just students of dance and her technique back in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and early 2000s. Miss Dunham taught literally until she left this place. And she taught us not only dance, but she taught us how to live. She talked about the mind, body, spirit connection. She taught us that, dance is in all of us. Different cultures have different expressions through dance. She shared a lot of that with people who wouldn't normally see these cultures and experience this dance and experience this music. She was a social activist, an anthropologist. Miss Dunham used her voice, and she was blackballed for it, but she continued to use her voice to talk about and speak against social injustices. So Miss Dunham's legacy lives on through each of her students, but it also lives through this data. And so Harmony and Kate will talk a lot about what they've collected, and what they've learned. And it's pretty amazing. So we're happy that you're joining us today. So just sit back, relax, and listen to more information about Miss Dunham's data.
Thank you, Amber, for that terrific intro. We are so lucky to have you to have this connection. And we're excited to be presenting here today as part of Love Data Week. So I'm Kate Elswit.
I'm Harmony Bench.
So we lead a project called Dunham's Data, Katherine Dunham and Digital Methods for Dance Historical Inquiry, which is funded by a 3-year project grant from the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. And on this project, we're joined by dance history postdoc Tia-Monique Uzor and digital humanities postdoc Antonio Jimenez-Mavillard. So clearly you see Harmony and I here today, but our process is extremely iterative across our whole team. And it really involves moving back and forth between data set structuring, curation, visualization, and analysis.
So Kate and I have been collaborating since 2013 when we began to ask questions about how to use digital methods for the field of dance. Over the years, our collaboration deepened and we began to focus more explicitly on the importance of digital methods for understanding dance's transnational circulation. This work centered around what we called movement on the move and how to create data sets and data visualizations that represent dynamic spatial histories. Dunham's data takes a critical mixed methods approach to ask, what are the questions and problems that make the analysis and visualization of data meaningful for dance history? And it does so through the case study of mid-century African-American choreographer Katherine Dunham, who worked across 5 continents in many contexts, including as an anthropologist, teacher, artist, and activist. When we first visited Katherine Dunham's archives at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale in 2016, we realized just how exemplary a model Dunham is for this kind of work. We began a pilot project focused on 1950 to 53, which we're currently expanding to 1947 to 60, with the ultimate goal of representing the mid-1930s to early 1960s. As an anthropologist and touring artist, Dunham really set the stage for asking how movement moves, because she traveled around the world for decades, and her choreography was also invested in representing the many peoples and places she encountered. These resulting interconnections matter because Dunham's aesthetic practices were deeply entangled with her relationship to diaspora.
In addition, Dunham was an extraordinary self-archivist. She saved so much material that it's actually possible to do the kind of work we're doing now, like figuring out where she was every single day for 14 years as she traveled around the world. In Dunham's data, dance is both a mode of thinking about archives of moving bodies and an object of historical study. So as Harmony mentioned, the core motivation of the project is to explore the kinds of questions and problems that make the analysis and visualization of data meaningful for the study of dance history. Yet bodies, bodily experience, and embodiment pose unique challenges for the digital humanities, and we're interested in what our training as dance scholars can add. When scholars speak of bodies in a data context, it's often to acknowledge the risks of dematerialization and to critically examine how subjects and their material circumstances are represented. This is especially important when seeking to represent Black embodiment and experiences while resisting what Jessica Marie Johnson calls, quote, the devastating thingification of Black women, children, and men that's entangled with histories of quantification from the slave trade onward. Our methodology is informed by feminist and anti-racist discussions in the digital humanities. Dunham's data engages with the bodies in the data and the ways that digital methods can evidence and elaborate bodily experience. In a forthcoming essay in Debates in the Digital Humanities, we identify the limits of current critical DH calls to bring back the bodies and propose what an engagement with what we call visceral data might look like, in which bodies are articulated as experiential, in which practices of embodiment arrange knowledge, in which bodies stand as repositories of memory, in which they're recognized as processual rather than static, and in which physicality produces relationality.
Our plan for today is to focus on the 3 core data sets we've manually compiled from undigitized archival materials. Drawing almost entirely from sources that Dunham herself chose to save, these data sets document Dunham's daily whereabouts, which is over 5,000 days from 1947 to 60. The almost 200 dancers, drummers, and singers who traveled with her over that time, and the over 200 pieces they performed. Digital methods offer a unique way of collecting all that complex information about places, people, and pieces together. And as we said, we're focused right now on 1947 to 60, but we're continuing to expand. So we're going to show you the underlying data sets, which, thanks to a partnership with the data repository at the National Archive of Data on Arts and Culture that Amber facilitated through ICPSR, we'll be able to release open access to the public over the next year. And we'll also show you multiple approaches to data analysis and visualization that help us transform these data sets into dance-specific arguments.
So to get into our process, we start by working in special collections and other public archives to manually compile this data into data sets. Every data point has a story and sometimes multiple conflicting stories, and we evaluate how to best represent those discrepancies as part of the data set, or rather as part of the story as well. So I'm going to share my screen now. This is one of the core data sets that we've been manually curating for Dunham's data. It's an itinerary of where Dunham was every single day from 1947 to 60, the years of her most substantial international touring. The goal of this itinerary is to create a comprehensive reference that includes travels for which the historical importance may not yet be known, or which might emerge through the study of travel itself. And we see this as a kind of backbone data set. It's not really as sexy from a dance perspective as some of the other material will show, but you'll see later on how many other data sets and visualizations rely on this basic question of where Dunham was when. For this itinerary, we routinely cross-reference and reconcile information from performance contracts, receipt books, personal logs, personal professional correspondence, newspaper clippings, and so on. To these, we add supplemental data sources, including immigration records, local newspapers, and historical transit maps and schedules.
This data set shows what we know and how we think we know it. So for example, if we go to January 30th of 1950, here we knew from Dunham's letters that she arrived in Cairo from Paris in the first half of this particular week. And then we found airline route maps from the winter of 1950, which showed that that particular route was only flown by TWA on Tuesdays or on Thursdays. So then we consulted historical calendars to figure out that Dunham was performing in Paris through Monday the 29th, traveled between cities on Tuesday the 30th, and then stayed in Cairo for a short time before traveling onward to Italy in early February. Not all data points take this much work to validate, but quite a lot of them do. We often have to reconcile conflicting information from the archives, and we keep track of that decision-making process in the notes column. Here we summarize the logic of each point. And in the next column, we also keep track of the archival and other sources we're consulting so that other people can follow our trail later on. Because we're working across multiple archives, we also see these data sets as themselves serving as a kind of index that connects up the holdings of different special collections.
So we had our first data release last fall, which is the 1950 to 53 itinerary, as well as a few repackagings that Antonio has done for us. For example, grouping locations within a certain distance of one another. Users who register on NADAC's site can be notified of future releases for each individual data set. And our plan is to release the 47 to 60 itinerary as an update to the 50 to 53 by the end of this year. And so that's when we're still in the auditing process, but right now we have 97% of the days accounted for. However, every day for 14 years is over 5,000 days, which no one can really think of all that data at once. And so we also experiment with different types of computational analyses and visualizations as a way to better understand what we're seeing at multiple scales. So to start with, we've been building static and interactive timelines by place, which are particularly helpful for thinking about duration and where Dunham's stays accumulate.
Here's an interactive timeline we've been building. It's worth mentioning that this itinerary follows all of Dunham's travel, regardless of whether or not she was performing, but we also keep track of the venues where she performs in various cities, and she's in a lot of different types of places. So one of the things we're excited about with this timeline is that you can get an overview of Dunham's itinerary, and you can also get a lot of details. This moment is in September of 1957. Dunham has finished up a long run in Australia and New Zealand, and she's moved on to touring East Asia, where she contracted with the US Army to tour a series of bases in Japan and South Korea between concert hall performances that she gave in Manila and Tokyo. Dunham often did more than one show per night in the same venue, but she also performed in multiple venues in the same night. So for example, she'd give a concert show and then perform at a nightclub afterwards. This particular timeline can be organized chronologically, which is how it's organized now, or by most visited countries. And then if you hover over a given day, you can see Dunham's location, including the performance venue. And then if you click on a country, for example, Italy, a pop-up window will show you every city she visited within that country. In these 14 years, she traveled through 26 cities in Italy, and many of them more than once. And as you can see, this also acts as an interface for the data set that we were just showing.
So another way to see this data is to look on a map. So first, with just the 50 to 53 itinerary, we commissioned this space-time aquarium. So here, just so you understand what you're seeing, we have 1953 at the base map, and then the time rises as elevation, so the end of 1953 is at the highest elevation. So in these 4 years alone, Dunham took 134 trips to 83 cities in 26 countries. And this was an early experiment, but of course, a flat map doesn't really work outside of this small time frame because Dunham repeatedly crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And so Antonio's been working on turning this into an interactive globe. So here you can step back and you can see the enormity of Dunham's full trajectory, or you can hover over individual lines to discover various trips and her time spent in individual cities. So we see these visualizations as offering a spatial rendering of Dunham's personal geography and travel, and also showing how her legacy is truly global.
We've also done some super nerdy statistics in order to better understand this data. And something that we're thinking about is the structural racism that Dunham faced. In our recent essay in the journal Theater Survey, Katherine Dunham's Global Method and the Embodied Politics of Dances Every Day, we explain how the process of manually curating this granular day-by-day data set also drew us closer into Dunham's travel as a project of making do and illuminated the political injustice she faced. As we followed the ways in which plans were changed last minute, we became aware of the instrumental nature of stays in cities that haven't really been on the radar of Dunham scholars. In so doing, we began to realize how Dunham's transnational circulation was entangled with her pursuit of solvency in the face of many obstacles, which propelled Dunham, her performers, and her work into the world in the mid-20th century. That essay works through the historical and physical implications of this travel itinerary in detail, from statistical modeling around trips and how such data can make visible the structural racism that Dunham faced, to the compounding impact of such a brutal travel itinerary on Dunham herself.
So for example, we've figured out that over the 1950 to 53 timeframe, most of Dunham's trips are between 2 nights and just under 2 weeks. Her median stay length in any given one location is 3 nights. In other words, she's almost constantly on the road. We've also compared Dunham's travel to that of her modern dance contemporaries and noted that she tends to travel more frequently, performs in much smaller cities, and stays for shorter periods of time. So we've been thinking a lot about how these overviews can also help us to identify other places important to Dunham's history that aren't necessarily reflected in the scholarship. So for example, the Western US and Canada, where she performs in nightclubs.
Okay, so we've been talking about how Dunham traveled through the world, but we haven't really talked much about her company. So let's focus there. Between 1947 to 1960, almost 200 dancers, drummers, and singers from various international locations joined and left Dunham's employment. And we're interested in how a granular data perspective can explore how participation in Dunham's company transformed over time, who was in the studio together, and how this facilitated a process of body-to-body transmission. We structured this data set as a series of check-ins, and the data for these comes from everything from documents like payroll books, which is an image we have here, people scribbling their names to get their payroll, to run notes. So for example, a note that says that Tommy Gomez missed his entrance is also evidence that Tommy Gomez was there that night. We've also had to build a supplementary data set to keep track of information, including performers given and their stage names. Oletta Williams, for example, is also Boots Wade, but Williams alone is not enough to identify her because her sister Jeanette also toured with Dunham.
Across 1947 to 60, we average 1 check-in every 2 to 3 weeks. And we're not going to show this data set now, but we've been experimenting with different approaches to documenting and visualizing uncertainty, and we're happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. Concurrently developed, these multiple data sets support one another. So as an example, if we find a program in Italian that doesn't list a theater or a year, the first thing we do is look to an evolving data set of performer check-ins to begin to identify the time span during which the named performers were employed by Dunham. We then return to our everyday itinerary to determine when within that time span the company was performing in Italy. And then we might further refine that dating using newspaper views that reference specific pieces of repertory. Such newly dated programs in turn then feed back into our other data sets, including personnel and repertory.
This is an interactive chord diagram, which allows you to click on an individual and see the many other artists with whom they shared time and space. So if we scroll around and hover over Eartha Kitt, who is a popular performer, everybody knows. She's in the earlier part of our data set. Earl Wilson is, he comes in later on and is connected to many other individuals over time. So many of our visualizations are built as tools for our own inquiry, but this one was built as an outward-facing tool. It's still in development, but we were interested to enable users to explore the connections between individuals in a somewhat simplified form.
So the colors on that chord diagram come from this network graph that we built to see which performers shared the most check-ins. So it calls attention to the specific people central to maintaining the company's embodied knowledge and memory. It's not surprising to see familiar names such as Vanoy Akins, Ricardo Avalos, Lucille Ellis, Linwood Morris, and so on at the center of this network. However, there are also other individuals who straddle multiple groups and thus form crucial cross-generational links. At the same time, being part of multiple communities or generations of Dunham's company is just one of the ways to think about continuity. So for example, certain figures like Glory Van Scott or Julie Robinson, who've emerged as central to preserving the Dunham legacy, are less visible from this perspective. And this also doesn't include the ripple effects beyond the company. So almost every time we've shown these personnel visualizations, someone in the audience has identified a teacher or other personal connection.
Another visualization that we built helps us to see this same personnel data set and its connections between company members over time as a chronological flow diagram, which tracks 189 individual performers through Dunham's employment from 1947 to 60. So here we let go of the colors that designate different generations in favor of calling attention to continuity and gradual change in who shared time and space. We shade each performer by the first time they appear in our data, from dark blue for the earliest performers to light blue for those who joined later on. You can click on an individual and trace their trajectory through the company. So here again is Earl Wilson, who first appears in July of 1950, and he remains with Dunham for over a decade. You can also click on a particular moment in time and see the full trajectories of every artist who shares that particular check-in. So this is July of 1955 when they're in Mexico City, and you can see how in that moment there are performers who were present as far back as where our data set begins in 1947 and who still remained in 1960. We see this as a visual argument that traces potential lines of transmission. Some of the ways that artists could have encountered knowledge that preceded them and passed on knowledge that carried forward from that moment onwards.
So for example, one day we clicked on every performer who ever performed in Veracruzana. So Veracruzana has a cast of 15, but we've identified 53 performers who appear in the piece from its premiere in 1948 until the end of our data set in 1960. When we highlight all the performers, we can begin to see a chain of body-to-body knowledge, as well as how this piece of repertory itself functions as a kind of memory that holds the community together. So that knowledge about Veracruzana depends on the repertory data set, which we'll show in a moment. This process of joining data sets helps us to think through the connections between the places to which Dunham's traveled, the performers who traveled with her, and the pieces they performed. So for example, here we connect our data set on performer check-ins with a data set on additional info we'd have about them, specifically the passport nationalities of Dunham's dancers, drummers, and singers. And what's conspicuous is that as her international circulation increased, so too did the multinational balance of her company. Most of the company held US passports in 1947 when she first started to tour internationally. But you see how that changes by 1960.
We also put this performer data and the check-ins together with Dunham's travel itinerary, and we noticed that during or after Dunham appears in a specific country, often new company members of that particular nationality appear in her employ, bringing culturally specific knowledge with them. So the orange bars on this particular chart represent the time spent in a country, and the blue dots indicate when dancers carrying that passport joined. So for example, this dot is Ricardo Avalos, and he joined around the time Dunham was performing in Buenos Aires. Now, we've often heard stories about Dunham traveling around the world and picking up performers as she went, but we didn't really understand how frequently it happened until we looked at them all at once. By looking across these multifaceted connections that Dunham herself drew between people, pieces, and places, it's not only a question of how Dunham represented diaspora in her choreography, but also how diaspora moved through these works and through the bodies of performers. Clearly, there's a lot more to say here, and this is something that Kate and I are looking at from a bird's eye view. And to answer Patricia's question in the chat, is something that Tia-Monique is currently digging into to discover some specific examples to think through how the conversation about diaspora coming out of this data fits with more conventional models of dance scholarship, including movement analysis.
So the last main data set is Repertory. So here we seek to understand the relationships among the almost 300 works that we've cataloged of Dunham's choreography. So as we started to build this data set, we realized that Dunham was constantly reframing and repackaging her choreography in a much more complex hierarchy than a list of works alone would suggest. And this is something that happens to us a lot. We start to build a data set and quickly begin to discover once again that the world is a lot messier than the discrete chunks with which we began. So here are a study image of two programs to help explain this phenomenon. So this one comes from Belfast in 1952. This one comes from Copenhagen in 1959, and both contain Brazilian suite, which is what we call a container. And containers normally have 4 to 6 pieces inside of them. So between these two particular instances of Brazilian suite, some pieces are the same, some pieces are different, and then there's one piece that is part of the container in 1952 and exits to become a separate standalone in 1959. So you can see this kind of process of nesting and reconfiguring between just these two programs. But our full repertory data set for Brazilian suite is built from 60 programs on which it appears. And across those 60 programs, we actually see 16 pieces total coming in and out of Brazilian suite, many of which then also appear as standalones or in other containers. And there, just to mention, we won't do a full tour here, but there's a lot more that we're trying to capture in this data set as well. This is in fact the third iteration of this data set. So first, Harmony and I built one iteration to begin to figure out how we structure the data, what we can capture, what seems possible. Then Tia-Monique started from the ground up to build a new version based on that first structure we had, and also proposed additional iterations. And now we're cleaning and expanding a reconciled version. So in addition to programs, the repertory data set also collects information from various program drafts, from show patter, from newspaper criticism, and also from correspondence that we find in Dunham's archives. And the data set holds more information than the visualizations that we're about to show. So for example, Certain pieces scale up and down for different venues, increasing or decreasing the number of performers, as well as lengthening and shortening in duration. And we try to capture that as well.
As you saw in the data set, we track the relationships between works by categorizing them in a nested hierarchy of evening length shows, which are orange, containers, which are red, pieces, which are blue, and also what we call dances in dances, which are aqua. And those are generally named social dances. But because Dunham is constantly repurposing elements, it's hard to come to a definitive answer about what constitutes a work for her in a fundamental way. For example, approximately 40% of what dance scholars would typically categorize as a piece appears as part of 2 or more containers. We also use the color purple to designate works that sometimes are standalone and sometimes appear in other containers. So let's look at an example. Plantation dances, which includes the dances in dances Palmer House and Hambone, was originally part of Briar Rabbit from 1938, but then plantation dances became the opening number in the ballet Southland in 1950, as well as part of a container called Field Hands and Plantation Dances. Then Field Hands and Plantation Dances were each sometimes part of the many pieces. Dang it, my light keeps going off, I'm sorry. when you don't move. That loosely made up the container called Americana, which itself was performed throughout the 1950s. And you can see how many other pieces are connected to Americana. This gives us a way to see how movement practices circulated within Dunham's choreography through the remixing of Repertory. Plantation dances alone connects Repertory from as early as 1938 through the 1950s across many iterations.
So within our main Repertory network graph, most pieces are no more than 3 or 4 steps from one another, and all are connected within 10 degrees. In this period, for example, the Caribbean Rhapsody show is a particularly strong central bridge between various clusters within the Repertory network, which makes sense because we've documented 24 entities that are part of it at various times. Among containers, Americana, Brazilian Suite, and Motivo similarly contain the most pieces, 15 to 20. Or looking in reverse, between 1947 to 60, 13 pieces belong to 3 to 5 containers, many of which also stand on their own. So looking this way, Dunham's Repertory emerges not as a series of discrete works, but rather as a body of knowledge, an interconnected set of gestures, rhythms, and practices that link performers, including those who may never have performed together at the same time.
The Repertory dataset also captures both Dunham's particular language in describing times and places of her choreographic work and the real and imagined geographies that they index. So if we go back to those programs for Brazilian Suite, you'll notice how Dunham described these pieces in terms of various reference to place. In the 1952 program, Acarage is framed as a narrative story about a street vendor in Bahia. Choros purports to be a historical play on a 19th century Brazilian quadrille, and Frevo has the most anthropological referent as a study of Carnival in Pernambuco. Here is an early experiment in returning these to a map. While Dunham is known as a choreographer who mines US and Caribbean practices, what interests us is the view of the world that is represented by the broader geographic reach of Dunham's oeuvre. The lines between pieces tether them to one another in the same way that we previously discussed with the Repertory network, and therefore also create further connections between these places of inspiration. The works in Repertory thus not only reference geographical locations and cultural practices, but subsequent touring also circulated these rhythms and gestures to other places. As we explore this aspect of Repertory inspiration, we've also taken the information back off a map to visualize how Dunham's choreographic relationships to place shift over time.
So Lynette's project for us today was to speak to the unexpected places in which we've found data. So we thought we might just make a list of some of our favorites. So we have a list of the different shoes required for performers, number by number. We have lighting cues for particular theaters. We have sign-up sheets by scribbled first name for field trips to see community dance. We have hotel room allocations we couldn't possibly comment. We have invitations both accepted and declined, custom stamps inside of passports for which we've had to reach out to speakers in many languages. We have postcard postmarks that are very often different from the locations depicted on said postcards. We have casting and recasting lists, telegrams, which also include telegram routing codes, visa petitions, receipts from dry cleaning bills to petty cash to purchase orders, notices to remove individuals from company publicity, updates to the parents of underage performers, show patter, nightclub napkins, list of luggage weight and contents, and so on.
Beyond the project itself, these various datasets can be helpful as a wayfinder that connects together the contents of different archives for future studies of Katherine Dunham. But they also do something else, which is that they offer different ways for interdisciplinary scholars from other fields to connect with Dunham and her artists and her work. For example, we've had dance scholars who work on Brazil and on Cuba approach us to learn when Dunham was in those places, which then changed how they understood what they were seeing in their local context. This applies to many performers who appear in our datasets as well. Takia Nuramin, who worked with us earlier in the project, was interested in what this data work could do for the profile of dance in terms of African American intellectual history and broader genealogies of knowledge in African diasporic circulation.
So we're in the process of auditing the data sets that we've been building. And as part of this process of auditing, we're also interested in beginning to, we're sort of setting up different conversations. I think something that's been interesting to us from the start is how these various data sets that come out of archives fit with folks who hold various pieces of oral history and embodied memory around this work. We're also excited to get back into the archives once we're able to do so again in order to further expand them. Our goal is to be able to release all three of the core 1947 to 60 data sets before the end of 2021. We'll be making many of these interactive visualizations available for public use online. But in the meantime, we've been trying to keep our blog up to date with samples of works in progress. Our newest essay is coming out in April of 2021, and you can get all of these info about all of these various moving parts from our website, which is dunhamsdata.org. So that was our very brief tour, and we're so excited to chat with you to hear about any questions that have come up along the way.
Kate and Harmony, we did get a couple questions in the question and answer area and in the chat. I'll read one from the chat first. This comes from Patricia Mulani Loss. Sorry if I butchered that. I am curious if you can also layer in movement analysis of the dances themselves when footage is available, in addition to the location, and employing methodology like Laban notation to access the themes and shift over time within choreography and interpersonal relationships. Can we get to questions about the movement, body changes in relation to place? So it sounds like she's looking for, kind of more information about the dance and if you've thought about how to layer that into what you've already collected.
Kate, do you want to speak to this?
Sure. I feel like this is, I think yes and no. So I think there's a scope of this project that is very specific. I think we're interested. One of the things we came to this project saying was, well, this is going to be an easy conduit to movement analysis, right? I think Harmony and my initial pitch was, oh, we're really interested how Dunham's choreographic and ethnographic work are related, right? So she's traveling around the world, she's picking things up, she's making pieces about places, those pieces about places are traveling to other places. And so we said, okay, well, the first thing we need to do is figure out where she was. Well, that's a huge project, right? And then as we began to look at this, and as we began to think about what is it that if we're really looking at data, we can begin to think about collecting. And so I feel like we've ended up thinking a lot in this sense about who the dancers are who are coming in, what is that index? But this is for us really, it feels like an important next phase of the work is to also take folks who have much more expertise in Dunham practice, in African diasporic practices more broadly, and really seeing what they see when they cross this data with their own work. And so this is one of the things that's happening right now is our postdoc Tia-Monique, who's trained specifically to think about British Caribbean diasporic work, has been beginning to identify a few specific containers and digging more into these questions of movement analysis. But I think that's something we're so excited to see happen with this work, but it feels like there's a lot of infrastructure to get there. And just to say, the other thing that we are discussing right now is IDTC, the Institute for Dunham Technique Certification. These data sets are all built out of archival materials, out of primarily Southern Illinois University, Missouri Historical Society, and so on. It's these objects that are in boxes, and we're looking at that. And so something kind of not within the scope of this project, but as a next step, is we've been speaking with IDTC about what it would mean to build a data set straight out of a studio, what it would mean to actually work with folks who have this technique in their bodies, who have the oral history in their body, in kind of that knowledge, exactly as Amber started us out with. And what kind of data sets can be built, say, directly from a studio that might be different than the data sets we're building from archives.
I saw the question from Bob Ray Bordelon about the availability of the data. I didn't realize that if I posted a link, that the question would go away. So I don't know if you all can see it, but I did send the link to the publicly available data, which currently is the 1950 to 1953 travel itinerary. And then, as we said, we're looking forward to continuing to make things available, but that's the location where you're going to find it. Oh, and Amber just posted it in the general chat. I'm sorry, I'm the whole like Q&A format versus the general chat format. That's new for me.
I see a question here about the back end of the project, metadata choices, what's being used to create interactive visualizations. I think in terms of, I can get started and Harmony can jump in. So I think in a lot of ways, one of the questions we have is, what is necessary, what is possible? So for example, there's Jonathan Bolin has a great essay on some of the structured metadata for thinking about performance data more broadly. And someone like Jonathan Bolin is looking at, well, theaters, performers, that there are certain ideas that it would be helpful for us to begin to sync up as we think about this very limited number of performance data sets in the world. And at the same time, I think we're also coming into this, as we said, not saying what do we already know, but what is it that it's possible to find out? So as one possible example, and sometimes that's helpful, we sit down and we say, okay, we're going to make a list of pieces and make a repertory data set. And then we realize that the idea of a piece is really complicated. And then that becomes the data set in itself, is then tracking the complications of this idea of a piece. And likewise, we've also had things where we've started, there are certain particular types of data that we've started to track and realized. So for example, initially we thought, okay, we're going to try to see if we can figure out where each of these performers is coming into the company from and where they're going when they leave. But the problem is most of them join and leave 4 or 5 times. And also then where they're going on to becomes very complicated. And so there's this spiraling ripple effect that it would be amazing if someone could then build this for every one of the performers, every one of the 189 performers who's kind of around this work separately, and then we could start to put those together. But I think within this project, that was something that then was too unwieldy. So I think the short answer is we're both trying to stay open so that we can particularly join up our data with other existing data sets at the same time as we're trying not to be so inflexible that that we get locked into understandings that actually don't work for this data.
Just in terms of some of the concrete things, I think that the timeline was built just with JavaScript, and that everything else has been Python, except for the fly-through video of the map. That was kind of like a whitish, tannish globe with the blue dots. That was built in ArcGIS. That was something that we hired out of the project. One of the things that we've been really grateful to have a data scientist who's committed to the project is that we realized that kind of hiring out somebody to do some of the more sophisticated visualizations wasn't well, certainly it wasn't economically feasible on an ongoing basis, but also we wanted someone to really understand and work with the project itself, and help us to design new visualizations, new tools, and not only kind of fit dance into pre-existing boxes, but really figure out, well, if we're doing this project, what does dance need, and what does the idea of performers touring, what does that idea need? And you know, some of the tools that are available for text analysis, for example, just are not built to do that kind of inquiry.
I think that also connects to something we've been thinking about a lot, which is sort of the multimodal nature of this project. That I think we showed, you know, box plots of Dunham's travel, which mean a lot when we think about embodiment, as long as there's a long essay explanation that goes with them. Right, and so that's been something that's been evolving for us over time, is this question of what does dance data actually need to look and feel like, and maybe how is that different? And I think that's something we've only just begun to scratch the surface on, but it's coming up for us increasingly as a really important topic. I see this question about the US State Department policies. Harmony, do you want to chat here? So speaking of travel on behalf of the US, has anyone mapped State Department dance performances over time in relation to US foreign policy priorities?
That's a very interesting question. Well, there are 2 texts that I think come close. One would be Dance for Export, and the other by Naima Prevost, is that how you say her name? And Claire Croft's Dancers as Diplomats. Those are the 2 studies that come to mind in terms of tracking touring in relation to what the State Department has to say. It's not something that we have focused on really with Dunham's data, but I think that that's a great question in terms of like how what are the systems in place, what are the infrastructures that allow touring performers to travel abroad, and certainly foreign policy and State Department initiatives contribute to people's ability or inability to tour for sure.
And I see Colleen tossed in a newspaper, a local newspaper article from Newfoundland. And of course, the interesting thing is actually our association with Newfoundland is Gander. So at this moment in time, Dunham is traveling through, if you're going to fly across the Atlantic, you can't just fly across the Atlantic. So Dunham would, for example, go out to an air base, a kind of an airport in New Jersey, and then that plane would take several stops, and then there would be sometimes a very long layover, sometimes an evening in Gander, and then the flight from Gander would go to Paris. So we have a weird, there's this
a weird connection.
We have a weird number of objects that travel through, like postcards and so on, that are all connected to Gander.
But thank you for sharing that that newspaper article.
Penny's asking about video clips.
Yeah, I think that the aspiration is definitely there in terms of things that are already available online, certainly as part of the Library of Congress's digital archive. And so, you know, making those connections across these different holdings is really important for us. I think that, you know, the wonderful thing about the availability of those video clips is that they are findable. In fact, Amber just sent us one this morning that she had come across, and I think that, you know, they're going to continue to crop up as people identify scenes in films and whatnot that maybe where Dunham hasn't been identified. There's a question about that. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think something we're thinking about right now is, this is a 3-year project. So we said that the first, you know, the first 2 years, we're going to figure out what data set we can build, figure out what kinds of visualizations we can do. And the 3rd year, we're going to think about what it means to put it in the world. So right now, I think, to be quite honest, a lot of what we're showing you are things we've built for ourselves. And that's now a much bigger question that we're having among our whole team is, as we open up these very elaborate visualizations online, folks come to them wanting very different things. They have different interests, there's different ways to navigate them and so on. And so that's really, I think, the project for the next year, for this final year of the project, is to begin to find new form, to begin to find some shareable forms. And I'm not sure that we can do everything at once. I think it's still going to be a provisional shareable form, even at the end of this year. But that question about how we can connect up to make this accessible, because I think also it's the underlying data as well. Like, it's helpful for us to be able to show the programs to explain why we think a container is this important thing, right? And so I think beginning to connect up all of these different pieces of historical material to what we're doing feels really an important next stage.
There's a question about a database, and which just makes me laugh a little bit, because we've been very simple. We thought about standing up a database based on prior work, and we just ended up using Google Sheets, and then we cross-refer whenever we need to, like join tables, join data sets, instead of having, the thing is that we don't know what relationships we need to build, right, until they emerge in the process of research. And we also want it to be available we want the data to be publicly available, and it's like kind of the lowest common denominator in accessibility. And so we decided that for us, that meant, you know, comma delimited, you know, so we're just doing Google Sheets, multi-tab Google Sheets, and then through ICPSR and through NADAC, they make the data available in different formats. But yeah, we kind of cheated our way out of having to build an actual database. And then, yes, there is a plan for creating, as Kate was mentioning, we're kind of in the process of figuring out how to, like, what, how how to move this information out into the world. And so we're in the beginning stages of designing a final website that will house the visualizations. And so there, I don't know if I would call it an online exhibit at this point, but there will be an online home that collects all of the assets together, for sure.
And one of the things we've been talking about is how to create an online home that isn't just go into a single visualization, but actually that right away when you see a visualization says, oh, hey, there's this essay, there's this data set, there's something that connects all of the piece that stays transparent about the connections between these different pieces.
Thank you, Colleen, for the offer. We'll be sure to reach out.
Well, thank you so much, Kate and Harmony. As you will see in the chat, there is another webinar tomorrow afternoon that basically highlights all of the interesting data, like today's data, that ICPSR has that people may not know about. It's called Wait, ICPSR has that. It meets at 1 o'clock tomorrow, and Dory was kind enough to put the link in the chat. Is there a place where people can reach out to you, Harmony and Kate, if they have further questions and follow up and want to talk to you more?
Yes. I'm gonna just post, my email, and Kate can do the same. But the website is, Kate, I think you only sent it to the panelists. Okay. Yeah. Okay, cool.
There.
Yeah. So dunhamsdata.org is where we keep our research blog, and you can find out more about the project and ongoing work. And then we posted both of our email addresses where you can contact us directly if you have information or want to share other things, or just make sure that we're aware of something happening in the world related to Dunham and her data.
And we also have a sign up on the website if you don't really have something right now you want to talk about, but you just kind of want to follow what's going on. There's also a sign up sheet. We don't spam too much. A few times a year we send out an email being like, hey, here's what we've been doing.
Cool.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Great job. Thanks, everyone.